The year was 1871. In Japan, a new government had been in place for 3 years, and it was eager to modernize a country that had been under samurai rule for 7 centuries. Toward that end, the government dispatched officials around the world, both to study foreign ways and to convince Western audiences that Japan was a progressive and civilized country. One of the officials was Ito Hirobumi. He was then just a member of the finance ministry, but he would later become the Prime Minister of Japan. Among the highlights of Ito's trip was a gala dinner held on April 28th in Washington, D.C. The guest list for the dinner was impressive. It included such individuals as President Grant and Secretary of State Hamilton Fish. Ito spoke to this group of prominent Americans in English, and his speech was something of a mini course on Japanese history. Ito explained that Japan was an old country, more than 2,500 years old, but that during this time, quote, its intercourse with foreign nations has been exceedingly limited. Ito went on to note that during this long isolation, Japan had fallen behind the rest of the world. It had become despotic and backwards. But now, a new government, of which Ito was a member, was eager for Japan to join the Brotherhood of Nations. And then Ito thanked the guests for their support in what he described as, quote, putting in motion such reforms and improvements as shall place us upon a footing equal to the best of nations. Now, as a scholar who specializes in Japanese history and culture, I find Ito's speech fascinating for many reasons. And one of those reasons will probably surprise you, because when I read Ito's account, what I find most striking is that, well, it's just wrong. And I'm thinking especially about his idea that Japan had been isolated for most of its history. And while that idea may be familiar to many Westerners, the trouble is, it's not true. Now, to be fair, Ito was offering a reasonably accurate description of his own experiences. In fact, in Ito's childhood, Japan was isolated. His was the first generation in centuries to travel freely around the world, learning about foreign cultures, mastering foreign technologies. In Ito's youth, it was illegal, under penalty of death, to leave Japan. But in Ito's account, that level of isolation stretched back to the ancient past, and that's not historically accurate. Here's another distortion. As representative of Japan seeking support for a new government, Ito had an obvious interest in flattering his American audience. And accordingly, he emphasized Japan's relations with the West. In other words, when Ito spoke of Japanese isolation, he was specifically referring to Japan's isolation from the US and Europe. But that's a problem, because by arguing that Japan's, quote, intercourse with foreign nations has been exceedingly limited, Ito was clearly ignoring a few important places, like China and Korea, and in general, the rest of Asia. I think that's a big omission. Now, Ito's speech is just one example of this strangely pervasive view of Japan as somehow isolated, sitting at the edge of the world, disconnected from everything until, in 1853, the US arrived in the form of Commodore Perry and his 4 black ships, and Perry, like Prince Charming, he awakens Sleeping Beauty and he introduced Japan to the modern era. Now that image is quite flattering to the US, and it was certainly politically savvy for Ito talking to an American audience in 1871 to conjure up that image. But it's wrong. So as we launch our exploration of Japan's history and culture right out of the gate, we need to ask ourselves, what's a better view of Japan? Well, in this course, we're going to take a more nuanced view than the one that Ito offered his Western audience. Rather than a single clear break between isolation and globalization, we will treat Japanese history in cycles. Yes, there have been periods when Japan has been fairly isolated, but there have also been eras of extreme international and cosmopolitan engagement. Ito was describing his own experience living through the transition from a period of relative isolation to an era of global engagement. It was an era that began in the 1850s and continues to this day. Today, Japanese people actively and freely travel around the world. Foreigners actively and freely travel to Japan. Japan is deeply connected to the world economy and deeply enmeshed in international relations. But this ongoing cosmopolitanism, it isn't Japan's first globalization. In fact, it's Japan's third globalization. So, to set up our tour of Japan's cultural history, let's ask a big question. What were these cycles of great globalization and then isolation? Okay, to answer that, let's take a few minutes to move backwards through 2 millennia of Japanese history. Now we've started with the modern era, which we can call Globalization Phase 3. Working backwards, we come next to a period of relative isolation, which began in the 1630s and came to an end during Ito Hirobumi's lifetime in the mid-1800s. It was during this 200-year epoch that the shoguns implemented a series of policies drastically curtailing Japan's contacts with the rest of the world. Japanese subjects were banned from traveling overseas. The Portuguese and the Spanish were banned from Japan. The Dutch and Chinese traders who came to Japan were restricted to Nagasaki. Information about the outside world was tightly controlled. Books discussing Christianity were banned. But before that, from the 1300s to the early 1600s, Japan had been intensely engaged in world trade and politics. In the 1400s, for example, Japan was actually a haven for pirates who terrorized the coasts of Korea and China. And then in the 1500s, Japanese traders spread across Asia. There were large and thriving merchant communities in what is today Thailand, Vietnam, the Philippines, and of course, Korea and China. In the 1500s and 1600s, Japanese warlords employed foreign advisors. The most famous example is the English sailor William Adams, who inspired the James Clavell novel Shogun. And at the same time, Japanese samurai were serving foreign kings. The king of Thailand relied on Japanese expatriates as advisors and as mercenaries. And with all these interactions, you can't stop the inevitable from happening. Men and women from different places met, and they made babies. In fact, one of the greatest Chinese warriors of the 1600s, Zhong Chonggong, the most stalwart defender of the Ming Dynasty, he was the son of a Chinese pirate and his Japanese wife in Nagasaki. And here's another sign of those global times. In the 1590s, there were probably more Christians in Japan as a percentage of the population than there were in the 1950s. Think of that. So important were Catholic missions in the 16th century that powerful Japanese warlords, known as daimyo, sent ambassadors to the Vatican. And just by the way, the greatest Japanese warlord of that era, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, he decided in 1592 that he was going to take over the world. He declared war on China, he launched an invasion of Korea, and for 6 years, Hideyoshi's troops fought Korean and Chinese troops on the Korean peninsula. So, with apologies to Ito Hirobumi, this was not an era of isolation. Okay, we've just discussed globalization phase 2, which ran roughly from the 1300s to the early 1600s. So now let's go back. Let's go back one more cycle to a period of relative isolation, one that ran from about 900 to about 1300. Now, Japan was not completely isolated during this period. In fact, a few intrepid Buddhist monks went to China and brought back what became Zen Buddhism. But overall, this was not a period of great international engagement. In fact, most Japanese fighting during this period was defensive. In the 1200s, the Japanese fought desperately to stop the Mongol Empire from conquering their country. As you may know, the Mongols, who briefly had the world's largest empire, they conquered China, Korea, Vietnam, North India, Russia, and parts of the Middle East and Eastern Europe. They were terrifying as mounted warriors. But they were much less effective when crossing water, and their amphibious attacks on Japan failed. This is a huge point of Japanese pride. But my key point here is that in the 1200s, the Japanese state was not reaching out to the rest of the world. Instead, it was primarily trying to keep dangerous people away from Japan. So we can say that, by intention, Japan was relatively isolated for the 400 years between 900 and 1300. But let's move one more cycle backwards to the period from the 500s to around 900. And I would call this globalization phase 1. That ancient era of international involvement did not include Europe, but it did include vast parts of Asia. For example, in the 740s, the Japanese emperor commissioned one of the biggest Buddha statues in the world. It's been rebuilt countless times, but it still sits in the city of Nara inside Todaiji Temple. Anyway, at the consecration ceremony for this statue in 752, the eye of the Buddha was symbolically opened by a monk from India, and there were thousands of guests in attendance from across Asia. Here again, we see an internationally connected, not isolated Japan. In fact, during this first phase of globalization, treasures from as far away as Persia reached Japan. For example, the Imperial Treasure House at Nara has some strikingly modern-looking Persian glass. Moreover, Japan and the Korean Peninsula were deeply connected during globalization phase 1. The official records of the Imperial House show extensive intermarriage between Japanese and Korean noble families. Okay, so we've tracked back in time from the present to around 500. And we've seen that, contrary to Ito Hirobumi's description, Japan has not always been isolated from the rest of the world. Rather, Japanese history has moved through 3 cycles of international engagement, punctuated by 2 cycles of relative isolation. Now, I want you to keep these cycles in mind for the duration of this course, as together we deepen and enrich our understanding of Japan. And I'm calling our journey a cultural history because we'll be tracing the deep interconnections between historical events and the distinctive culture that developed in Japan over the course of 2 millennia. And the tension I've just discussed, the tension between isolation and global involvement, that creative tension has had a shaping influence upon Japanese culture. We'll find it at work in the visual arts, in woodblock prints, for example, and we'll see how it plays out in Japanese theater, literature, architecture, even film. So whether we're analyzing key characteristics of the Japanese language or describing the rich history of Japanese foodways, you should always be on the lookout for the ways that Japanese culture is uniquely a product of global engagement and isolationist impulses. All right, keeping that crucial point in mind, let's go back even deeper into Japan's past, back to the earliest human habitation of Japan and the origins of Japan's rich culture. So, how did people first get to the islands of Japan? Well, primarily they migrated down from Siberia along land bridges during the Ice Age. Although a few scholars would argue that there was also a migration up from Southeast Asia. As for when these first migrations happened, the exact dates are a subject of intense debate. Some argue for dates as early as 200,000 BCE. But there's a rough consensus that around 40,000 BCE, during the Ice Age, Japan was connected to the Asian mainland by land bridges, and that humans came over by about 35,000 BCE. By about 12,000 BCE, these early Japanese peoples had not only stone tools, but also simple pottery. And Japanese pottery is some of the oldest in the world. It's older than the pottery from the Fertile Crescent. And what's intriguing is that almost everywhere else in the world, pottery developed along with agriculture. But Japan developed a vibrant pottery tradition thousands of years before agriculture. In fact, this pre-agricultural period in Japanese history gets its name from the pottery. It's called the Jomon period because Jomon means rope pattern. And the pots were often decorated by pressing a rope into the wet clay. The Jomon era is commonly defined as 12,000 BCE to about 300 BCE. And Jomon pottery and tools give us some idea of what life and culture were like. Jomon people lived in small communities, in pit dwellings with tent roofs, and they hunted and they fished and they foraged. In short, they were semi-sedentary hunter-gatherers. Now, rather than thinking of this Jomon population as a single Japanese people, it's better to think of prehistoric Japan as a web of tribes, tribes that alternately feuded and cooperated. Now, Jomon period pottery is quite beautiful, and it includes not only practical and ceremonial dishes, but also fanciful depictions of people and animals. But the hunter-gatherers of the Jomon period did not have metal tools. This was an advanced Stone Age people. Now, around 300 or 400 BCE, life on the islands began to change with the introduction of two striking new technologies: wet rice agriculture and basic metallurgy. These were probably introduced by migrants from the Korean Peninsula. But wait a second. In the 4th and 5th centuries BCE, there were no Ice Age land bridges. So how did continental people get to Japan? Well, let's take a moment to consider a map of Japan, both to think about passages to Japan and to reflect on the broader question I've been addressing today, the question of isolation and connection. Now, Japan is actually 4 large islands: the main island of Honshu, Kyushu in the southwest, the small island of Shikoku, and Hokkaido in the northeast. It also includes many small islands, such as the Ryukyu archipelago in the southwest. And many Japanese love to explain Japanese distinctiveness by noting that their nation is a shimaguni, an island country. And that term island country reflects a sense of isolation. When we say no man is an island, we mean no man stands alone. And in Japanese, island carries that connotation as well. And many maps are actually designed so as to cut off Japan from the rest of the world. It looks like a cluster of islands in the middle of the Pacific. One common technique is to take the long Ryukyu archipelago and place it as an inset map somewhere off the west coast of Japan. Now, inset maps are fine, but that technique has the effect of making Japan look completely isolated. The inset map blots out the Korean Peninsula and makes Japan look like it's surrounded by endless expanses of open ocean. And that technique actually makes it hard to answer our immediate question: how did prehistoric peoples get to Japan? Because it seems like they must have crossed vast expanses of open ocean. So let's fix the map. If you simply center a map on the Sea of Japan, zoom out a little and rotate it, putting the east at the top, Japan suddenly looks closely connected to the rest of Asia. Japan is still an island country, but it's surrounded by other islands. Off the coast of Nagasaki, the islands are so close that you can get from Japan to Korea without ever losing sight of land. The maximum open stretch of water is about 40 miles. The same is true in the far northeast. It's about 30 miles from the tip of Hokkaido to Sakhalin Island. And Sakhalin runs all the way up to the mouth of the Amur River, and the Amur River stretches thousands of miles across Asia. In the far southwest, the distances are a little longer. There's one big gap of about 130 miles. But after that, it's small hops all the way to Taiwan, and from there, you can island hop to the Philippines. So from this perspective, Japan doesn't seem geographically isolated at all. Yes, it's a cluster of islands, but those islands connect to other islands. And island hopping or river cruising can get you to Australia or to the Central Asian steppes. So while cultural and economic isolation has always been possible in Japanese history, it has never been inevitable. Now, in the 4th and 5th centuries BCE, migrants from the Korean Peninsula crossed the narrow stretch of sea by boat and brought with them the technologies of rice farming and metal tool making. These people and technologies arrived first in Western Japan and then steadily spread across the islands. Now, the introduction of agriculture was once seen by historians and anthropologists as an unparalleled human achievement. Agriculture is basically the start of real civilization. But more recently, researchers have noted that agriculture doesn't automatically improve human lives, because even though it produces more food, it also produces new and more diseases. But that debate aside, one thing is certain. Agriculture means that some people can produce enough to feed others. And this allows for more hierarchy, for a bigger and wealthier ruling elite, and also for specialization. Some people can devote more time to skills like metallurgy, and then they can trade for food. In Japan, with the rise of wet rice agriculture, we see this exact phenomenon. We see the emergence of kingdoms with powerful elites, farmers paying tribute or taxes to support that elite. We find storehouses for grain, elaborate burial mounds for rulers, the emergence of specialized craftsmen, metalworkers. Now, the era in which this specialization and these new elites began to develop, the era that followed the Jomon period, it's known as the Yayoi period, and it lasted for about 600 years, from around 300 BCE to around 300 CE. And Yayoi, by the way, is the name of the neighborhood, the Tokyo neighborhood, where artifacts from the era were first discovered. Now, as Yayoi chieftains grew more powerful, they were buried in more and more elaborate fashion, commonly in larger and more complex tombs. And therefore, historians and archaeologists refer to the period from about 250 or 300 CE to about 587 CE as the Tomb period. That's based on those burial sites. We can also think of the Tomb period as an era of ancient chieftains. These chieftains were much more powerful than earlier Jomon leaders, but they were much less powerful than the coming generation of Japanese rulers. Now it's unclear how ethnically distinct this new ruling elite was from earlier Jomon people. Was the ruling elite largely new immigrants, or did the newer migrants intermarry and intermingle with earlier settlers? And did they then create a new ruling elite in the process? How many people migrated, and in how many waves? These issues are subject to ongoing debate. But fortunately, we do have those elaborate burial sites. And as elite burial became more lavish in the 3rd and the 4th and the 5th centuries, nobles were buried with terracotta replicas of the things they enjoyed in life. These statues are called haniwa, and a remarkable range of haniwa have survived. Dancers and shamans, wooden boats where we can still see the details of the fittings and the stays, horses with the details of the saddle and the bits and the ornaments still visible, a falcon, which we know is used for hunting because it's resting on someone's arm. And then we have this haniwa replica of a soldier. You can see his sword, and you can see what was presumably a leather vest with metal rivets. And in fact, many of these haniwa depict organic materials, like wood and leather, that have long since decayed, but they survive symbolically in these terracotta models. And that makes the haniwa both beautiful and valuable for understanding society in the late Yayoi period and the Tomb period. Now, Japan in that era was still a pre-literate society. The earliest Japanese writing is from the 400s, but we do have continental records, primarily Chinese records, of contacts between the Japanese islands and ancient continental kingdoms. These are mostly scattered references in classical texts. But one fascinating account comes from the late 3rd century, from something called the Weiji, or the records of Wei. That was the official government chronicle of the Chinese Wei dynasty. The chronicle contains a detailed account of a Wei Chinese ambassador's visit to the ancient Japanese kingdom of Yamatai. Now, we're not sure where Yamatai was. It was probably somewhere in northern Kyushu, and we're not even sure if the ancient name Yamatai is related to the modern word Yamato, which is another name for Japan. But according to this 3rd century Chinese chronicle, the Japanese islands were undergoing consolidation. They had been divided into hundreds of kingdoms, but they had consolidated to about 30. And one of these 30 kingdoms was Yamatai. Now, according to the ambassador's report, in the Weiji, Yamatai was ruled by a shaman queen named Pimiko. She had some sort of special direct connection to the gods, and the ambassador described this as magic and sorcery. Pimiko was attended by 1,000 female attendants, but only one man. That was her brother, and her brother helped her run the country. So Yamatai was ruled by a queen, but almost no one saw her, and the queen's brother spoke for her. Now, given that the most revered Japanese deity is a goddess, the sun goddess, it's fascinating to find a Chinese envoy describe a shamanistic matriarchy, indirectly controlled by the queen's brother. At any rate, there's an archaeological site on Kyushu in Yoshinogari that's actually pretty close to the ambassador's description of Yamatai. But there's one problem. When Pimiko died, she was supposedly buried with thousands of attendants. The description in the Weiji sounds like a huge live burial. But no one has found anything like that in Japan. Instead, archaeologists have found lots of clay figurines, those haniwa. So maybe the ambassador thought the clay models were going to be replaced with living people, or maybe the Wei envoy simply made it up. But the general attitude conveyed in the Weiji is significant. For the Weiji envoy, the kingdom of Yamatai was utterly inferior to China. Yamatai sent slaves to China as tribute, and in return, the Emperor of China sent back bronze mirrors and other products of advanced civilization. And what's more, Yamatai was ruled by a witch. And that attitude, that's a good starting point for the rest of our course. Because that Chinese condescension, that was part of the motivation that drove later Japanese kings to build more powerful kingdoms. By the time we reached the 500s, Japanese rulers had begun to figure out why continental kingdoms were more powerful. Those continental kingdoms could write. They could make powerful weapons from bronze and iron. So what did Japanese rulers decide to do? Well, of course, they imported those ideas. And that massive importation of continental ideas, that's something we can legitimately call ancient globalization. And, as we'll see, the goal and the eventual outcome of that globalization was a kingdom in Japan that could describe itself as China's equal, instead of a barbarian kingdom at the edge of the civilized world.